Behind my title is a really rather interesting kind of idea, which I'm pulling a whole load of material together from various sources, and I'm going to be talking quite a lot about Apollo and the idea of Apollo. So let's have a look at Apollo. This is a Roman carving of Apollo, and he's always seen as a handsome, unshaven youth, of course a Greek god, holding the lyre and standing by a tree trunk with a snake wound round it. This snake is Python, who he has an early encounter with. Python represents divination, or an oracular kind of skill associated with Apollo. The lyre is the musical instrument, but he has one other thing that he's associated with, and that is the bow. So the bow, the lyre, and divination are the three main features of this extraordinary god. And here's a kind of modern view of him. So if we look at his attributes, just briefly, he's associated with music, poetry, and the arts, medicine and healing, and strangely enough, producing plague, generating plague in cities, which is quite an extraordinary kind of negative thing to have. Truth and prophecy. He's the god of archery. He's associated with mathematics and astronomy. And in later times, in Greece and in Rome, he's associated with the sun. He's a solar god. He's associated with drawing the sun across the sky in a chariot. But really the most interesting thing about him in some respects is that he's a late comer to the Greek pantheon. He's a late god, and he seems to come from somewhere different. So let's just have a look at a traditional picture of him on a Greek vase. Here he is standing on the Delphic oracular place on the tripod where the Pythoness is going to traditionally be. That's the priestess of Delphi, the oracle, who for hundreds of years, lots of different priestesses of course, gave the oracular answers to questions in this extraordinary place, founded by Apollo. And here he is with his lyre, his bow, and his sitting in the oracular position. I'm just getting out my little red pointer in case I can see. This is the tripod here. We have to just tell you a bit about his mum. His mum is called Leto. She's a very revered goddess because she was rather beautiful, and Zeus fancied her like he fancied everybody. And very quickly, she was seduced by Zeus and gave birth to Artemis. Artemis is the sister of what will be Apollo. But the interesting thing about her is she's associated with being a she-wolf in the northern place that we call Hyperborea, the place of the north winds. Nobody knows exactly where Hyperborea is. Some people have suggested that it was north of Thrace or north of the Black Sea, but there are other people who finger more Western Europe and see it as possibly in the British Isles, and I'll be mentioning that a little bit later on. So after having Artemis, which was a very straightforward birth and so on and so forth, she disappeared up into Hyperborea for a while and then came down again to the Aegean area, where Zeus coupled with her again, and she became pregnant. And this time Zeus's wife Hera was furious, and she put out an edict saying there's no way that Leto can have her birth, have her baby on any solid land. It was quite impossible, and she knew she couldn't have it in the sea. And then some other gods very, very gently allowed an island to appear floating on the Aegean called Delos, and it was untethered, and it was very barren, and she had her baby there, and it was a long and difficult birth. And at the moment Apollo was born, there was a great bright light over the whole island, and at the same time a whole mass of swans came around the island, so the swan gets associated with this god. And he was quite a guy, because she introduced him to the Olympian pantheon of gods, and when he walked in the room or whatever they have at the top of Mount Olympus, all the gods went, wow, and actually stood up. And she was the only person who was allowed to be seated, and this becomes a very traditional kind of representation of Leto. And of course, when he was born, he made one of those utterances like all famous people do. Dear to me shall be the lyre and the bow, and in my oracles I shall reveal to man the inexorable will of Zeus. So he was kind of honoring his father. So he's always associated with oracular wisdom in this kind of way. Here's another picture of him at the time of his birth. And this is really very important. You can see him standing, well, he's kind of being born by his mum here. This is Leto. He's traditionally born by some palm trees. And he's immediately, as soon as he's born, holding his very nice Greek composite bow. This is his big sister now, Artemis, sitting in front, looking a bit pregnant, or maybe she's just lifting her knee. I'm not quite sure on the bars. And this monster at the end here is called Python, or Putheos. And his monster's been sent by Hera to destroy this family. She's furious those births managed to take place. But little Apollo fires his arrow and immediately kills the monster here. Hera is furious and sends another monster called Delphinus, but he's killed, or she's killed, with another arrow, and then a huge giant called Titias, and he's killed as well. So the point I'm making is these arrows are pretty special, and this archer is pretty special. This is Apollo. Here he is again, just to remind you, with these three key things: the oracle, the lyre, and the arrows. Now, I mentioned earlier on Hyperborea. Let's just find out what Diodorus Siculus, that writer between 80 and 20 BCE, or before Christ if you like, was writing about Hyperborea. You wouldn't imagine so on a day like this, if this is Hyperborea, but in the regions beyond the land of the Celts, and there is some new material which suggests that the Celts were really known to the Greeks as being around about southern Spain. So if we're going to look up beyond southern Spain to an island that's smaller than Sicily, we could finger the British Isles with some confidence. It's situated in the north and inhabited by these Hyperboreans, and the island is both fertile and productive of every crop and has an unusually temperate climate. Well, it did then, more so than it does now. And also Diodorus Siculus linked in Apollo straight away, because he said the moon on this island seems to be bigger than it is in other places. And Apollo actually comes to the island. Remember, his mother possibly originated from here. Apollo comes every 19 years, which reminds us of the major standstills of the moon. So this is straight away a kind of astronomical link. And he plays upon his harp, that's his lyre, and he sings and dances every night from the vernal equinox right through to the appearance of the Pleiades, which is in late July. So every 19 years, this god returns to Hyperborea and plays out this incredible astronomical kind of ritual with songs that get known as the Apollo songs, or the Apollo paean. And the Greeks really took this idea really very seriously. And the other interesting thing about Apollo is that he was born on the 7th day of the lunation, the maximum day of waxing energy. So he's already been linked in a very interesting way with kind of lunar ideas. Also, Diodorus Siculus said of Hyperborea that here Apollo has a stately grove with a renowned temple of a round form, beautified with many gifts. Well, many of you will recognize that as being the Stonehenge gift shop. And that this is indeed Stonehenge. I mean, whether it's Stonehenge or not, nobody knows. But various authorities have speculated that it might be. We're not quite sure. And then he also told us that Apollo has to him a city consecrated, whose citizens are great harpers. And there's a tradition that the Celtic peoples, even in Greek times, were people associated with playing the Celtic harp and were great musicians. And then finally, the sovereignty of this city was dedicated most definitely to Apollo. So the whole idea of Apollo kind of originating from Hyperborea was a serious idea in Greek thinking. Now, you might ask the question, well, where is this city? And this one man in the 18th century was quite confident that he knew where it was. This is John Wood, the master architect who masterminded the extraordinary development of 18th century Bath, the city of Bath in West Country. And John Wood knew that this was the city of Apollo. This was the center of Hyperborea. And he tried to, in the city, modern city of 18th century Bath, he tried to incorporate some of the traditional and classical ideas of the previous Bath of hundreds of years before, which he imagined had been set up by these Hyperboreans. I mean, he called them Druids, but he called them Druids because antiquarians in the 18th century called everybody who was older than the Romans Druids, and they really didn't have much idea beyond that. I mean, this is the Bath you know. This is the Royal Crescent, planned in a lunar shape to contrast it with the Circus, which is a round, sun-like shape, and Queen Square, which is the square of the Earth. This is John Wood's map in 1835, already showing the Queen Square area, the old Roman city here. This is before the rest of Bath got developed. Incidentally, this is north and this is south. It's on its side in this particular picture. Here is Queen Square, really remarkable, showing a kind of classical palace-like architectural style, although these are all individual private houses. This was a complete breakthrough in architecture in a domestic setting. And so what John Wood was trying to do was incorporate this ancient knowledge, which he felt the Hyperboreans actually had, and try to kind of put it into the city of Bath. He was no slouch either. He went off to Stonehenge and he surveyed it. He was an absolutely excellent surveyor. He was also an astronomer and possibly an astrologer. He surveyed Bath, and this survey, he surveyed Stonehenge, and this survey was the best survey that ever been until really the late 19th century, and it's remarked as such now. And he took the dimensions of the outer henge of Stonehenge, that ditch you've seen in the bank, that mile bank you walk round when you go there now, and he turned it into the dimensions of the Circus in Bath. So he was trying to incorporate this ancient knowledge and put it straight into the city of Bath. And because he speculated that the Druids had actually been at Stonehenge and he wanted to kind of remember their energy, and he knew that they were in oak groves and they were associated with, of course, acorns, he put acorns around the top of the Circus, as you can see here. He also went out to that other standing stone circle near Bath called Stanton Drew, and he surveyed Stanton Drew. And this, again, is a fairly accurate survey. And he identified in the measurements and the actual proportions of the circles at Stanton Drew what he fancied were the orbits of the different planets. And he actually wrote down that somehow or other this had been used by Druids to teach, like a Druid university, the ancient peoples about astronomy. Finally, he put all this down in a book called A Description of Bath, which came out in 3 different editions. And people buy this book. It's quite a difficult book to get hold of now, but it's very interesting because there's the kind of conventional history of Bath, which is reasonably okay from medieval times onwards. But before then, it's a kind of fantastical history of Bath, like antiquaries tended to write in the 18th century. It's full of all kinds of myths and all sorts of extraordinary stories. And people don't read that part. But if you read that part of the book, it's absolutely intriguing because he tells us that the traditional founder of Bath, Bladud, meaning the Wolf Lord, he tells us the famous story of Bladud. Bladud was the son of Hudibras, King of England in London, and he was sent off to Athens to learn about wisdom from the Greeks. And he came back and he contracted leprosy and he was kicked out of the court. He was told to go to the West Country where he might get a cure. And there in the West Country, he found this hot spring by a swamp. And at that time, he was working as a swineherd. And he noticed that the pigs got better again in the kind of nasty waters. And he managed to cure his leprosy. And so when he became king, he founded this city in the West Country called Bath. And John Wood knew about all this, but he thought there's more to this. He identified Bladud with another character, a character from Greek mythology called Abaris. Now, Abaris is identified in Greek mythology and written about by several Greek authors as a Hyperborean. Not only that, a priest of Apollo sitting in Hyperborea. And one of the things that he has is one of Apollo's arrows. He actually is the holder of an Apollo arrow. And this arrow is completely magical. You can sit on it like a witch's broom and fly at the speed of light wherever you want to go. And the Greeks told the story about how Abaris, with this magic arrow, he rode it all over Europe, and he went to various cities, and wherever there was problems and illness or disease, he could just take the arrow and just go psst, like that, and the disease would disappear. It's a bit like Doctor Who's screwdriver, you know, something really useful to have. So Apollo's arrow became a really kind of mythical thing. It carried a huge amount of information and energy in its own right. And John Wood wrote about this. He described exactly you know, what this guy looked like. And just to show you what an arrow, one of these Greek arrows actually looks like, that's what it would look like. That's a dart from a reconstruction of what a Greek dart or arrow would actually be. Finally, John Wood wrote down several things about this arrow which are important. First of all, says that the arrow was used by the Cyclops long before the main Greek pantheon to regulate the course of the earth about the sun with that about the moon and the earth. This arrow was being used as a kind of, I don't know how you want to put it, a sort of powerful object which actually regulated the heavens. It was associated with calendrical movements, with the actual patterns of the sun and the moon. It was also, and this is the most important thing really in the whole lecture, it was about a system of knowledge. And I've emphasized the system of knowledge from John Wood's writing because he mentions it several times. And it was the system of knowledge of the sun god associated with the British Isles at that time, who was called Belenus. Now, Belenus, John Wood said, was so keen on the idea of Apollo's arrow that he planted an oak tree to remember it in Bath. And indeed, he points out, John Wood, in his writing, exactly where that oak tree is, and says that, you know, the system of knowledge was, as it were, secreted in Bath in the form of this arrow with the Hyperboreans, and then acquired by Abaris. So this whole kind of story gets set up, and the place of the oak tree is now in a shopping centre, which was pulled down 2 years ago. And I can tell you that the oak tree representing Apollo's arrow is now in the Apple computer shop, and it's the third counter down on the left. That's exactly where Apollo's arrow is. I live in Bath, and I've done a lot of work, believe you me, on this. The other interesting and important thing about this story is that Abaris took the arrow, flew off to Athens, and when he got to Athens, they recognized him as a kind of extraordinary guy holding this information in the arrow. And they said, you'd better meet the man here. And he said, who's that? He said, there's a chap called Pythagoras. Oh, he's very interested in mathematics and wisdom and stuff. So he was introduced to Pythagoras. And when he saw Pythagoras, he immediately recognized Pythagoras as a reincarnation of Apollo. He was very excited. And he said, I've got one of the original God's arrows. I fly around with it all over the place. I'm going to give it you. You're going to need this. It's got all wisdom, all knowledge in it. Pythagoras said, I don't really need it. But in fact, he said, yes, you will, because you're going to give it to the world. So I'm giving it to you. And this was the story of Abaris meeting Pythagoras. And I've just put Pythagoras up here, banging some gongs, because Pythagoras is associated with finding all about musical harmony and all that incredible mathematics behind music. It's all very much the Pythagorean tradition. And just to give you slightly the woolies, I'm just going to put this up. Now, this is Pythagoras' theorem. And all of you who've ever grappled with any kind of geometry at some time in your teaching have seen this, and maybe you understand it and maybe you don't. It's a miracle in itself that the sum of the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides. Do you remember doing all that at school? That's why I put it up on squared paper, to kind of make you really nervous at this stage. Did you get your homework right, etc. Okay, so that's really all I want to say about that. I want to now change the subject. This is a lady called Anne Macaulay. She's standing by a standing stone. She was a remarkable Scottish lady who died in 1998. She was inclined to science, briefly went to Edinburgh University, was very, very interested in mathematics and music. And after she died, a remarkable book came out about her in which her interest in megaliths and standing stones and geometry and so on was all shown up. And that book is marvelous to kind of have a look at. But before she died, she managed to put a chapter into another book called Homage to Pythagoras. She was appearing there with people like Keith Critchlow and Robert Lawler, people who really kind of understand this very interesting and arcane area. And look at all the things which Pythagoras is associated with. So here is a lady fascinated with Pythagoras, also very fascinated particularly with music. And she became interested in the classical guitar. She was very fascinated with how it was tuned, and she wanted to understand the history of the tuning of the Spanish guitar. And she found that it was derived from the Greek instrument known as a kithara. And then she found that the kithara was traditionally tuned in the same way as Apollo's lyre. And so there was a kind of relationship between Apollo's lyre, that first musical instrument, if you like, the tuning of that, Pythagoras' work, the tuning then of the British, or if you like, Hyperborean harp, and then finally the tuning of the historical and then modern guitar. So she began to kind of work on this extraordinary area, linking all this together. And she identified and wrote in a remarkable chapter in this book about the way in which all these instruments bring together Pythagorean mathematics. And she called this the Apollo wisdom. That's what she termed it, the Apollo wisdom. And she then went on to see that the Pythagorean or Apollo wisdom was the basis behind so much of the mathematics in megalithic stone circles and so on. I just want to very quickly take you into the chapter that she wrote, because it's really extraordinary, because something quite magical happens in this chapter. The chapter relates to the idea of the word Apollo. She takes the word Apollo in its Greek form, which is Apollon, and she then does a mathematical analysis of this word, because it isn't naturally a Greek word. Nobody knows where it comes from, and nobody knows exactly what it's related to. Let me show you what she did. I'm going to go through this very quickly because there isn't time to go through it in detail. So don't worry, I'm going to go to the end point quickly. She took the two L's out of the name and saw that they were lambdas, the Greek letter L, and she turned them into two right angles. She put the right angles down like that, and then she took the two O's, the two omicrons that are either side, and she drew two circles around the rectangles like this to produce the beginnings of a kind of geometric figure. And she then took the alpha at the beginning of the name of Apollon and saw that as totality, and that would make a big circle around. She drew a big circle around like that. Then she took the pi, the two p's, and she then identified another circle. And finally, she ended up with the n, or the nu, at the end. And she finally ended up with this strange figure. I've gone through that quickly because you've got to read the book to see how she does it. But what she's done here is, in a very sophisticated way, look at the kind of almost symbolic synchronicity between the Greek letters and the mathematical forms that they relate to. And what she ends up with is this incredible figure in which she saw that this triangle here and all the relations and proportions on this triangle were actually related to the Pythagorean geometry and figures of the tuning of, finally, the lyre or the guitar. And that the most important representation on this figure is this relationship here between P and C, It's 4.45 units. And then she leaves it. And I looked at it and I thought, good heavens, this is incredible. She's taken the name of Apollon and she has identified the bow and the arrow in this figure, but she never mentioned it. She never wrote about it. I saw that this figure produced a bow, a composite bow, and this key relationship here, which she did notice was the key relationship of this whole figure, 4.45, was indeed the arrow. And all you need to know, I mean, it's a bit like, you know, some crazy hitchhiker's guide to the galaxy, all you need to know kind of figure is, but all you need to know is this figure 4.45 on the arrow, and you hold the whole of this wisdom, the whole of this mystery, the whole of this figure, the whole of the name of the God is there in that single one, 4.45. If we look at what one of these composite bows looks like, it's very, very similar to the figure which comes out of the geometry. It's quite extraordinary. So in constructing the name of Apollon, Anne Macaulay seems to have tapped into a rich symbolic synchronicity, or a form of deep truth of Apollo wisdom. I mean, it's synchrony, this. It's not certain etymological analysis. It's something more profound in some respects, and it fascinates me. She was also very, very affected by this guy. This is Alexander Thom, that extraordinary engineer, early archaeoastronomer at Oxford, who became really elevated in terms of his reputation in the early part of his career in the 70s and 80s because of the extraordinary surveys he'd done on stone circles and megalithic sites, particularly in Scotland. He then, I'm afraid, fell on bad times as archaeology, conventional archaeology, decided that his work really wasn't very comfortable and acceptable, and he's very much non-you now. A marvellous book's been written about that by Robin Heath called Cracking the Stone Age Code, which I do advise people to look at who want to know about Alexander Thom's work. But the point about Alexander Thom's work, which interested Anne Macaulay, was his various classification of megalithic circles. There were round circles and ellipses. There were flattened circles, type A and type B, and there were complex circles, and so on. And behind them all was Pythagorean geometry, 3, 4, 5 triangles, and 5, 12, 13 triangles. And all this was happening here in the British Isles around 3,200 to 1800 BC, and indeed earlier. I'll just take you to one of the things which I always call the National Health Spectacles picture. These are not lenses at your optometrist, but in fact these are flattened circles. And what's fascinating about these is that, and Thom pointed this out, that if you take a circle which has 360 degrees geometrically and make that represent 365 days of the year, or more accurately 365.242 days, if you take the flattened type A circle, which was found many times by Thom but is more or less avoided by conventional archaeologists, but I have a lot of time for this, you find that it represents 354.368 days, which is the synodic lunar year. And if you take the type B circle, you find that it represents the eclipse year, the sort of time approximately between one set of eclipses and another. So these stone circles were carrying an extraordinary type of wisdom or knowledge. And these things all very much impressed Anne Macaulay. Robin Heath has written about all this in Bluestone Magic, a wonderful book about sites in Wales, which again I recommend you to read. And it's particularly brought to mind a remarkable 5, 12, 13 triangular system, which he first found at Stonehenge, and then found perhaps extraordinarily represented between the Preseli Bluestone site, the Isle of Lundy, and Stonehenge itself. A figure which Robin found could be used to predict eclipses. And this is just extraordinary kind of wider eternal knowledge, or what? If you then take another writer, Howard Crowhurst, who's working at Karnak, he's done some extraordinary work at Karnak in the last 10 years, again with conventional archaeologists having very little interest in it. And he's particularly looked at double and triple squares and how they're used in the design of the stones. And here's just a quick shot of that. You can see how triple squares are identified in the angles of these standing stones. You've got to read Howard's book to find more out about this, but this again is representation of what I would call the Apollo wisdom, the Apollo knowledge. So we go back to Anne Macaulay, and she re-surveyed many stone circles and found lots of new material further on than Tom had ever found. She particularly found that the pentagon was used again and again in these flattened stone circles, which I found very interesting. So she extended knowledge of what we might want to call the Apollo wisdom. She found relationships to phi 1.618, the golden mean, and the Fibonacci sequence, and so on. So I'm really just emphasizing there was a huge amount of work, really eternal knowledge again, being done by this extraordinary lady. Now, time to go into the field. In the middle of North Northumberland, there's a remarkable site, which again archaeologists have avoided really wanting to contemplate, a place called Beacon Hill. I first went there when I was about 10 years old. It's a hill with a kind of a flat piece here, a kind of ridge, and in front is a cup and ring marked stone, which just puts you into context. Below that ridge is a scatter of large stones, which actually was described in the 19th century as a stone circle. But in fact, archaeologists say they can't find one. Where my wife Celia, who's sitting over there at the moment, on this picture is standing, there is a stone. On that stone, there's something quite remarkable. The stone is big. It's about a big cube of about 9 or 10 feet round and about 7 or 8 feet tall. But you can see there's a hole right through it, quite uniquely, 9 feet long. You see that tiny hole there? Now, this was discovered by a friend of mine in 1987 when he was out walking with his son, David Thompson. Was my friend. I put this picture up because he and I were getting together in 2002 to write a paper about this. He'd already written a paper about this site for antiquity and it was rejected. So we were going to write again as two scientists and try again to get this properly accepted. David sadly died the day before he was to meet me of a coronary, and I really dedicate this lecture to him now. Where he's sitting is a little carved notch where you put your chin. You see there? And if you turn the picture around, you can see you put your chin on the carved notch and you've got your head exactly in the orientation of that hole. And at midsummer sunset, that's the picture you see. Absolutely dead on. Now, this is a place that archaeologists have seen and they say there's nothing there. It's all natural. They say this is a completely natural place. I mean, it's just mind-blowingly unnatural. Here's Celia and I in 1992. We've been many times with some friends, again at midsummer sunset. And in case you don't really believe this, you archaeologists, let me show you this stone. You see all at the bottom here? This is this tumbled mass of stones. I've shoved the bamboo in the hole, and on the other side of the stone, there's another hole. You can put the bamboos in either side. They're in a straight line. They just didn't finish this stone off. It's one of those. So this is all sitting on a Northumbrian mountainside. Yep. Sorry, there's the hole there. See it at the bottom. There's another one on the other side. And also, when I was there with David in 1987, I saw there were these two rock faces here. Let me see where they are. Here and here. That's the stone with the hole there, that big one. And then there's this other rock. And I realized that they were on an exact east-west equinoctial line. And that at the equinox, you could look east to where the sun would be rising over the sea, 26 miles away on the horizon. and you get this incredible sort of shaft of light coming through this scheme. And I realized that it would show up on the hill above where there was a rock. There's the gap where the equinoctial line's going to be, and then there's this rock on the side here. And I got very excited. I was with my son at the time. We ran up the hillside, and I said, I'm quite sure that beyond the edge of this rock, there will be a marker. But there was just nothing except, as I ran up to it, a rock covered with heather and mud, and I cleared it probably for the first time in centuries. First of all, I identified this extraordinary face, which you can see here with eyes and nose. And then you can see the rock where the shadow of the equinox is going to fall, and there's a carved mark on it here. Can you see that carved mark? Now, I pulled the heather off that in 1987, and it wasn't known about before. I'm really proud of that, because that was a piece of prediction that there would be a mark from, as it were, Neolithic times, which there was. It's now called the sundial stone. It has a special name, but I'm really proud of that. So here we are on the morning when the sun rises, and here is the rising sun. A really kind of dramatic thing. And when we go up to see where the shadow is, it's falling along the line, just like that. And there's Celia just pointing it out for us. And this has all been written up by a scientist friend of David Thompson's called Crispian Oates. He's produced a very lovely book about this, but no archaeologist has ever bothered really responding to it. So I went down and looked at this rock again, and I thought, I'm going to survey these rocks again, this place which is not supposed to be a stone circle. So I measured it all up. See, I used my old mathematics Pythagoras paper again. And then I finally joined it all together, and it makes a perfect type A flattened circle of the Thom variety. So in this circle here is incorporated the synodic lunar year of 354 days. Now, I'm telling you all about that simply because this is the Apollo wisdom that's right there in England right now. Right, change of scene again. We're now going to look at the Platonic solids. You've all been into sort of crystal shops and seen these things. This is my little tiny set. I haven't got any bigger ones I've photographed, just to show you. Each of these 5 figures you can place inside the inside of a tennis ball, so that the circle of the inside of the ball will touch the corners of each of these figures. This is the cube, this is the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron. They're the only forms in which each of the sharp corners will touch the inside of a sphere. Nothing else will at all. Now, the extraordinary thing about this is that Plato, when he wrote about this in the 4th century, identified that there were, in the tetrahedron, octahedron, and icosahedron, which the Greeks referred to as fire, I'm getting mixed up now, air and water, the Greeks identified that there was a triangle, 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90 degrees triangle here, which was common to these 3 forms of the 4 elements, these particular 3 forms, and therefore Plato thought they were intermiscible. You could move one from another. Earth had a different kind of triangle. That was the cube, and that was an isosceles triangle. And then the final triangle in the dodecahedron was the 3, 4, 5 Pythagorean triangle. So the Plato identified the 3 basic triangles with the formation of the entire cosmos. This was the view, which is quite extraordinary that this kind of thing was around. Now, they're called Platonic solids because Plato first described this, but believe you me, as Keith Critchlow points out in this book, Plato was not the first person to identify Platonic solids. Remember, to understand a Platonic solid, you've got to be aware that this sphere encloses this incredible crystalline shape. Here they are again, just to remind you what they look like. And what Keith Critchlow points out is that they were also in Scotland, 3000 BC, over 400 of them carved in granite. The same figures. Each of the 5 figures of the Platonic solids were carved in this extraordinary form, with these little bands were just put on to sort of show you how they come out. In other words, there were people in Scotland in the 3rd millennia whittling these things, just doing them for fun. What? There were people in Scotland making these figures in granite, and they're not grave objects. They've never been found in graves. They've just been found kicked up in farmers' fields, down sewers or whatever in Scotland, and they're nowhere else in Europe. They're only in Scotland. They've been written about formerly by a lady called Dorothy Marshall in a marvelous paper with the most incredibly edifying title of Carved Stone Balls, which just leaves you with what it is. She describes 400 of them, and after she'd done the paper, she had to write an addendum, a second paper, because 26 people had come out of the woodwork and said, hey, we've got one of these on our mantelpiece, but they didn't know what they were, all over Scotland, so she published a further paper. But she never ever said what they were for or what they were about, because she didn't know. And archaeologists hardly ever taken this seriously. They are natural products. This is my crystal octahedron here, which I bought probably from a Glastonbury crystal shop in fluorite, and here's my little platonic solid next to it. Aren't they lovely? And a very nice thing about Pythagoras is it is said in Pythagoras' sort of biography by Iamblichus that, in fact, his father was a gemologist. So Pythagoras, as a little boy, went into his dad's jewelry shop and saw his dad cutting jewels. What a marvelous place for a little boy to grow up who's going to go on and revolutionize mathematics and all that later on. And how do you do these things? Well, this is an octahedron. It's got 8 sides. It's got 6 points, and if you put a kind of mushroom thing on the 6 points and start to carve it, you get the impression of the original octahedron, and at the same time the sphere that it also is. And that is an incredible thing to carve in the 3rd millennium. It really is. Sitting there, remember, you're dressed in skins, you're terribly dumb, you just come out of a cave or something like this, and you're doing this kind of thing in Scotland. You know, come on. And here is a beautiful example of an octahedron, also fused with a cube. Do you see how somebody's put the cube and the octahedron in one form? In other words, the idea that 2 platonic solids could kind of overlap, and you could still have the inside of a tennis ball round every single point. Do you see the wisdom that's there? Quite mind-blowing. And then another one next to it. And then the final gift that the Scots gave the world. This is, of course, as you well know, a football. It's, of course, it's a dodecahedron. This was the symbol for ether, or the whole universe, because it was the closest to a circle in all these figures. And indeed, Plato wrote about this using his mouthpiece Socrates. Socrates is always his mouthpiece. Socrates is sitting there, and some guy comes up to him and says, hey, Socrates, you're a wise man, you know everything. Tell me, what does the universe look like? Socrates smiled and said, it's like a child's leather ball. And that's what Plato wrote. It's like a child's leather ball. There it is. This is FIFA, you know? There it is, the symbol. Don't tell me that this isn't the center of the cosmos. There's a European Cup final coming up very soon, Champions League, come on. You know. The most exciting object is this one. This is called the Towie ball. It came from a sewer in Aberdeen, and it's my favorite object because not only is it a tetrahedron with this implicit extraordinary wisdom in it, but it's also got the symbols, like you see, at the entrance to passage graves in Ireland and parts of Scotland and Malta and so on. These spirals are associated with a change of dimension because it's been found that the spiral is most likely to be found in the first third of a passage grave when you're walking in. I'm reminded of what David Rohl was telling us yesterday about walking in, walking eastwards. It's that kind of interdimensional change. But in these islands, this was the symbol, the symbol of the... and this is, I have a facsimile copy at home of this. It's the size of a cricket ball. I've told you about football in this lecture. Cricket is my other passion, and I'm wondering whether there's a lot of wisdom in cricket in the same kind of way. And this is a map of where they came from. Mostly Aberdeenshire, one in Norway, one's been found in Ireland, probably exported. There's one or two in North Northumberland, but the majority are up here and in the Orkneys. 400 odd stone balls. And Paul Devereux, who we've already heard about earlier this afternoon, he has recently, in that marvelous journal that he helped to found called Time and Mind, a peer-reviewed journal, he reviewed Keith Critchlow's book again, and his paper was called Archaeology with Balls. He's saying, come on, when are you going to take these balls seriously? And it's a very, very serious point he's making. Now, I just quickly want to dash through some Bronze Age artifacts. I'm going to rush into the Bronze Age now, just briefly. What I want to share with you quickly here, and it just means some pictures to look at, is that the Bronze Age artifacts, many of which, and I'm not talking about them here today, I have actually analysed from museums all over Europe, is that they have symbols and they have markings on them, which if you count them, show that the Bronze Age peoples in Western Europe had a preoccupation with cycles of the sun and the moon in a very sophisticated way. And this reflects a calendrical and astronomical tradition. Objects like this, the famous sun chariot from Trondheim in northern Denmark, found in a bog, like everything in Denmark is found always in a bog, with a sun disk on one side and a bronze on the other side. And this, of course, is a very Apollo-like thing, isn't it? This is the chariot of the sun being drawn across the sky. And when you look closely, you see all these kind of twists and walls. And if you count them, the mathematics that come out of counting them put you straight back into the Apollo wisdom, and I've been doing that. This is the famous Nebra disk, approximately the same age, something like 1600 BCE, a Bronze Age thing. Bronze Age in the west of Europe comes in around about 2200, not in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe. So this is the Nebra disk, which obviously is something to do with stars and moons and things, and therefore astronomical, and people have sort of tried to put constellations on it, and it looks like this. My favorite objects, though, are the famous hats. These are gold hats. This is called the Berlin hat. It's got a brim. Here's an even taller one. Can you imagine a shaman wearing a hat like this, about this tall, covered in these extraordinary things? Here's another one. There was 6 of these found again in a bog in Ireland in the 17th century, and the Irish guy who pulled them out, so it said, he thought they were actually something to carry water around in, but he tore them up and handed them out to his friends for gold, and so we don't have any in the British Isles. Here's another one, and if you look closely at these things, they're covered in symbols. Symbols of the moon, symbols probably of the sun, and they have been counted and analysed by some German scientists, and a calendrical system on the hats has been identified. And this is very sophisticated. Again, we're talking about 1300 and a little bit later material. And if you were wearing one of these hats, you might say, well, what about the next piece of your clothing? And maybe that's in the British Museum, this beautiful cape from mould in Flintshire, which again was found by some farmers who ripped it up, and then a clever local vicar started to buy the bits back, and the British Museum got the rest and reconstructed it. But a very, very beautiful object. Finally, I'm just going to say a little bit about Barry Cunliffe's ideas. Sir Barry Cunliffe, Professor of Archaeology sometime at Oxford University, and a very interesting and influential figure, who in the last 15 years has developed an idea that there was an Atlantic seaboard culture. It's very controversial, this, which possibly had quite a lot in common. The Atlantic seaboard culture from many, many years ago may be partly derived from the fact that nearly all the genes on these islands come from, in fact, what's called an Ice Age refuge many, many years ago. So we're talking 15,000 BC. 80% of the genes in Ireland and Wales and 70% of the genes in Kent come from this source. And all this has been written down beautifully in this book by Stephen Oppenheimer. The later influences in these islands, the Vikings and the Saxons and the Romans and the Normans and all the rest of it, they only amount to 5 to 7% of our genes. So if you're white Anglo-Saxon, whatever, so-called, you're actually somebody who's come from the Basque Country. This is where you've actually come from. Now, the interesting thing about this view of Barry Cunliffe, this Atlantic seaboard culture, is that, of course, it's associated with this. The megaliths, the megalithic culture, the culture of stone builders and stone circles, the stone balls that I was talking about up here in Aberdeenshire and so on, these are associated conventionally with dates that start off around about 4,800, but even perhaps earlier, the 5th millennium. This is where these stone objects seem to come from, and the art that's associated with them is also very similar up and down that whole seaboard. It's very dangerous to speculate that this was one kind of culture. I'm not saying that, but there were certain commonalities which are incredibly important. Here's a map of where you would find those kind of symbols, up right the way to the Orkneys and all the way down to Portugal. Possibly later on, these people began to speak the same kind of language, which was essentially some kind of Celtic language. And Barry Cunliffe has actually contemplated that this Celtic language was a language that moved from the seaboard eastwards into Europe, and in forming the later Hallstatt and other cultural groups associated with Celtic ideas and language, which are then supposed to move westwards. But Cunliffe is actually arguing that perhaps the beginnings of the Celtic language as it was formed on the western seaboard then moved eastwards. So when we look at the megalithic culture, we've got figures perhaps in Ireland as early as 500 BC. These predate any other megalithic culture that I'm aware of where there's some astronomical orientation. There are earlier megalithic cultures, but do they have a kind of astronomical wisdom? And then we sort of move slowly eastwards to Newgrange and then Stonehenge. And it's interesting that all this predates at least the megalithic pyramid culture in dynastic Egypt by some considerable time. I mean, the exact dates when you want to start logging pyramids are still very much in doubt, but we've got to say probably in the 3rd millennium. So you've got to ask, what is the influence of the Atlantic seaboard culture in terms of the rest of Europe and more? This kind of wisdom that I've been talking about. Well, this is Duddow standing stones in Northumberland. I just put the moon on this picture because it reminds me that the calendrical aspect is always there. Here's a 10-meter high standing stone in Brittany, the biggest one that's standing in Brittany at the moment. We have nothing like this in the United Kingdom. And in Brittany, at the place called Brise, there is the largest standing stone in Europe. This is Le Grand Menhir de Grise, and here it is lying on the ground. It was 66 foot tall, 66 foot tall from the ground. It's dated to about 3,800 BC. It's been worked beautifully, rather like we were seeing those Peruvian stones this morning. It weighs 348 tons. It's 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers or 80 kilometers away from the rock that it was taken from. People aren't quite sure which quarry it came from. You need something between 15 and 30 people, men, to pull a ton of stone. So you need something between 5 and 8 or 9,000 people, 3,800 to heave this thing along, and it's pretty tough territory. I'm not going to talk any more about that, but I'm just kind of saying, well, this was some really extraordinary kind of technology and ability and mathematics. This place, this standing stone is in a very key place. So, you know, it's just a speculation, this. I go back to Abaris. There he is, holding the extraordinary bow and the arrow of Apollo. I put to you seriously that Apollo's arrow is a symbol, as John Wood saw it in the 18th century, for an extraordinary degree of knowledge. And so my final speculation, did mathematical and calendrical wisdom move from the Western European Atlantic seaboard Neolithic towards the Mediterranean eastward, so that it could be then taken up by classical Greece and then redistributed to the world? And is this system of knowledge of Apollo's arrow partly the foundation of Western civilization? Thank you very much.